From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I know we've got the board's attention. I know they've heard us. Let's make sure they take action. Actions speak louder than words. I want you all to keep fighting. Today is not the only day that matters. Pay attention to the school board for the rest of your high school career and even farther.
As a county school board in Colorado proposes to rewrite the district's history curriculum to stop teaching about civil disobedience, students and teachers respond with acts of civil disobedience of their own. Classes have been canceled twice in Jefferson County as teachers stage mass sick-outs and students walk out of class. Then to Rikers Island Prison here in New York.
The adolescents in Rikers are walled off from the public, but they are not walled off from the Constitution. Indeed, most of these young men are pretrial detainees, presumed innocent until proven guilty.
We'll look at how a 16-year-old high school sophomore from the Bronx ended up spending nearly 3 years locked up at Rikers Island after he was falsely accused of stealing a backpack. Even though he was never convicted, the teen spent nearly 800 days, that's about 2 years, in solitary confinement. And we'll look at how one county in Mississippi is being sued for holding prisoners for nearly a year without formal charge or access to an attorney. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S.-led bombing campaign in Iraq and Syria has seen its biggest day so far, with British warplanes joining the attack. At least 24 strikes were launched between the two countries, where the Islamic State controls a vast stretch of territory. Britain took part in the strikes for the first time since its parliament voted to authorize the campaign Friday. The strikes today have hit towns including Syria's Kobani, which has come under a sustained Islamic State assault that's forced tens of thousands of Syrian Kurds to flee. The White House has confirmed its relaxed standards aimed at preventing civilian deaths for the U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. According to Yahoo News, the Obama administration's acknowledged that a policy announced last year calling for near certainty of no civilian casualties will not apply to the current bombing. The admission came in response to queries about a strike that killed up to a dozen civilians in the Syrian village of Kafr Daryan last week. The bodies of women and children were reportedly pulled from the rubble after a missile hit a home for displaced residents. The United Nations, meanwhile, has issued a new warning over the dire humanitarian conditions in Syria. Briefing the Security Council, Emergency Relief Coordinator Valerie Amos said the World Food Program will be forced to end operations unless it can obtain additional funding.
Millions are short of food, of medicines, and almost 3 million children are not in school. 11 million vulnerable people inside Syria require urgent humanitarian assistance, and of those, 6.4 million people are internally displaced. Without additional funds, the World Food Programme will be forced to end its operations completely within 2 months. Rations have already been cut in order to continue to reach as many people as possible. Winter is fast approaching, and vital supplies are needed to protect people from the cold.
The Taliban has carried out a suicide bombing on 2 buses carrying soldiers in the Afghan capital of Kabul, killing 7 people and wounding 21. The attack comes one day after the signing of a U.S.-Afghan security pact that'll keep 10,000 U.S. troops in the country after this year's formal end to combat operations. U.S. Ambassador James Cunningham signed the agreement at a ceremony on Tuesday.
This agreement will enable the United States to help the security forces to build on this progress after the ISAF mission comes to a close and as a new NATO mission begins. Our close defense and security cooperation will provide the foundation for Afghanistan to continue its impressive development and to build on the achievements of the past. Our agreement will also contribute to stability not only in Afghanistan, but throughout the region.
The new Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, signed the accord after his predecessor, Hamid Karzai, refused to ratify it. Tens of thousands remain in the streets of Hong Kong in the fourth day of mass protests calling for greater political freedom. The demonstrations swelled over the weekend after a crackdown on students opposing China's plan to select candidates in Hong Kong's 2017 elections. Protest leaders have vowed to remain and take over government buildings until the resignation of Hong Kong city leader Leung Chun-ying and a free vote for his successor. Today's protests come as China and Hong Kong observe National Day, which marks the anniversary of China's founding, Communist China's founding. A patient who recently returned from Liberia has been diagnosed with the first case of Ebola in the United States. The head of the Centers for Disease Control, Thomas Frieden, announced the news on Monday, one day after the patient's admission to a Dallas hospital.
This individual left Liberia on the 19th of September, arrived in the U.S. on the 20th of September, had no symptoms when departing Liberia or entering this country, but 4 or 5 days later, around the 24th of September, began to develop symptoms. On the 26th of September, initially sought care, and Sunday, the 28th of September, was admitted to a hospital in Texas and placed on isolation. We received in our laboratory today specimens from the individual, tested them, and they tested positive for Ebola.
The CDC says family members and others who made contact with the patient after he fell ill could be placed in isolation to prevent wider infection. Passengers who traveled on the same U.S.-bound plane wouldn't be at risk because the virus is only spread through direct contact with bodily fluids of a patient showing symptoms. At his news conference, Thomas Frieden said he believes this case will be contained.
The bottom line here is that I have no doubt that we will control this importation or this case of Ebola so that it does not spread widely in this country. It is certainly possible that someone who had contact with this individual, a family member or other individual, could develop Ebola in the coming weeks. But there is no doubt in my mind that we will stop it here.
President Obama has reportedly approved a plan that would let several thousand child refugees from Central America apply for asylum in the United States. The approach focuses on having the children apply from their home countries instead of making the dangerous trek to cross the U.S. border. The plan does not increase the number of refugees allowed in, capping visas for Latin America and Caribbean at 4,000. Oklahoma prison officials have released a new protocol for executions following April's botched lethal injection of Clayton Lockett, which lasted 43 minutes. Media witnesses described Lockett writhing and moaning in apparent agony. Lockett was injected with an untested cocktail of drugs, which included midazolam, a sedative also used in other prolonged executions, including one that lasted 2 hours in Arizona. The new protocol in Oklahoma allows the continued use of midazolam, but calls for a dose 5 times what Lockett received. Changes also include more staff training, contingency plans for when problems arise, and a reduction of the number of media witnesses at executions by more than half, from 12 to 5. More damaging revelations have emerged about the Secret Service amidst an uproar over an armed intruder who made it inside the White House. Secret Service officials previously said Omar Gonzalez, a former Army sniper who was carrying a knife, was caught near the main entry. But it emerged this week he actually managed to run past a stairway to the first family's living quarters and through the East Room before he was apprehended. The Washington Post now reports the agent who caught Gonzalez was off duty, but happened to come across him after his breach. Secret Service agents had also observed Gonzalez around the White House in the hours before he jumped the fence. Appearing before a House panel, Secret Service Director Julia Pearson apologized for the incident.
It's clear that our security plan was not properly executed. This is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility, and I will make sure that it does not happen again. I am committed to the following: a complete and thorough investigations of the facts of this incident, a complete and thorough review of all policies, procedures, protocols in place that govern the security of the White House complex and a response to this incident, and based on the results of that review, a coordinated, informed effort to make any and all adjustments to include training and personnel actions that are necessary to properly ensure the safety and security of the President and the First Family and the White House.
Secret Service Director Julia Pearson came under repeated criticism throughout the hearing, with several lawmakers calling for an independent investigation of the Secret Service's competency to protect the president. The outcry grew Tuesday with news that an armed security guard with a criminal record was allowed to ride in the same elevator as President Obama in Atlanta earlier this month, a major breach of protocol. President Obama hosted Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Tuesday for a White House meeting. Modi also met with top congressional leaders and Secretary of State John Kerry. Kerry praised Modi's massive reception before thousands at New York's Madison Square Garden on Sunday.
No matter how warm our welcome here today, we're never going to be able to top your rock star reception at Madison Square Garden. Billy Joel called me this morning to make sure he hadn't taken his regular gig there. None of us have been able to turn on a television or pick up a newspaper without seeing the celebrity coverage that the Prime Minister has received. And with it, for all of us, there's a sense of shared excitement and a sense of shared possibility.
Prime Minister Modi also had a private dinner with President Obama and a couple dozen people at the White House. Before his election as Prime Minister of India, Modi was barred from the United States for many years over his role in 2002 anti-Muslim riots that left more than 1,000 people dead. Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat, where the killings occurred. He's never apologized for or explained his actions at the time. British prosecutors have dropped a new terrorism case against a former Guantanamo prisoner who spent 3 years in U.S. custody without charge or trial. Mozam Beg has been held for 7 months in Britain since his arrest on terrorism charges related to a trip he made to Syria. Beg, who heads the prisoner advocacy group CAGE, has said he's being harassed for investigating British complicity in torture. Earlier today, a British judge ordered Beg's release after prosecutors said there is insufficient evidence to bring him to trial. You can see our interviews with Mozam Beg at our website at democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. On Monday, 2 high schools outside of Denver, Colorado, canceled classes after dozens of teachers called in sick in protest of the county school board's proposal to revamp the district's history curriculum. This is the second time in 2 weeks that teachers have staged what they're calling a sick-out, with 72 of 102 teachers at Golden and Jefferson high schools reporting absent on Monday. Teachers are also protesting a pay grade system that ties their salaries to performance reviews. Last week, hundreds of Denver area high school students staged a walkout to voice their concerns over the proposed changes to the history curriculum. They held cardboard signs with slogans like "Don't make history a mystery" and "Keep your politics out of my education."
The protest began after the Jefferson County School Board announced it was considering reviewing the curriculum of advanced placement history courses and adding more material to, quote, promote citizenship, patriotism, essentials, and benefits of the free market system, respect for authority, and respect for individual rights, unquote. The proposed changes also call for the removal of course materials that, quote, encourage or condone civil disorder, social strife, or disregard of the law, unquote. Newly elected school board member Julie Williams recently criticized how history is currently taught, saying, quote, it has an emphasis on race, gender, class, ethnicity, grievance, and American bashing, while simultaneously omitting the most basic structural and philosophical elements considered essential to the understanding of American history for generations, she said. Well, for more, we go to Denver, Colorado, where we're joined by 2 guests. John Ford is with us, president of the Jefferson County Education Association. He's a social studies teacher at Moore Middle Middle School. And Ashlyn Marr is with us, Chatfield High School senior, one of the students protesting the proposed curriculum changes. We also invited Jefferson County School Board member Julie Williams to join us in our program, but did not receive a response. John Ford and Ashlyn Marr, welcome to Democracy Now! Ashlyn, when did you get a sense that things were changing?
Well, I have been paying attention to the school board for the past year, and I have been increasingly more concerned about what's been going on. And when I heard about the first teacher sick-outs, I realized that more students were interested in being involved and standing up for their education. So I took the incentive and just started educating people. I wanted to let them know what was going on. So I started presenting unbiased information, posting on Facebook, and talking to people in the hallways. And before we knew it, we had a huge following.
John Ford, explain exactly what is going on.
Well, over the last 10 months, we had a school board majority that was elected into office. They were a conservative group that started to push a conservative agenda. And last week, 2 weeks ago, when this proposal came out to create a committee to censor certain parts of our curriculum, I think that's what hit the nerve. And it not only hit a nerve with the educators in Jefferson County, but it really hit a nerve with our students, our parents, and community folks as a whole.
And this Julie Williams, who's leading the charge on this issue in the school board, to your knowledge, what are her credentials for being able to analyze and dissect the problems of the American History AP curriculum?
Well, as far as I know, none.
Yep. She released a statement saying that she does not have the authority herself and the background in history to make those judgments, which is why she was creating the committee. But she also never released any statements that the people on the committee would have those qualifications.
Speaking on MSNBC, Jefferson County School Board member Julie Williams defended her proposed changes to the curriculum.
I'm not saying let's not teach history accurately. What I'm saying is let's not encourage our children to disobey the law.
Can you respond to that, Ashlyn Marr?
I am not aware that I broke any laws. I think that I was standing up for what I believe in, and that is what, people in America have done for centuries. It's the foundation of our country. I took AP U.S. history myself, and all I was presented with were the facts. And then I made the opinions based on those facts. I was never told what to think. And these protests are entirely student-led, and it's what people think is right.
And John Ford, while the students are involved in their protests, the teachers also have particular grievances in terms of policies of the school board. Could you talk about the concerns that led to the sick-outs of the teachers?
Well, once again, I think it's a culmination of things. We have a board majority that consistently over the last 10 months they've been secretive, wasteful with taxpayer money, and disrespectful to our community. So we put all of those things together, and then you put in this, this new committee to sanitize or purify curriculum. I think that's where the nerve was hit again, and we're concerned about the AP, or the College Board, is a nationally recognized institution that goes throughout all the United States and several different countries, and this one hurts kids. So, the teacher walkouts and the student protests and the parent concerns are all stemming from multiple issues.
But what are specifically the teacher concerns that are being expressed in those sick-outs?
Well, first, we'll go back to the AP and the censoring thing, but over the last 10 months, our Teachers Association has been engaged in negotiations with their contract. And the contract itself is something that's been a 45-year tradition in our school district. And we've had a long history of collaboration with the school board and the superintendent, and that's all coming to an end. At the end of last year in May, we went into negotiations. they stalled out, and we went to an independent fact finder. And the fact finder, his recommendations, we went into whatever he determined that the Teachers Association would agree with, and we hoped that the school district would too. But at the end of the day, the fact finder found in favor of the teachers, and the school board rejected those recommendations and moved on with their own agenda, and unilaterally instituted a salary scheme that's based on merit pay that's very, very confusing. And to this day, I still don't think they know what's going on.
Soon after the College Board issued its new guidance for its advanced placement U.S. history course, the Republican National Committee condemned the new standards as radically reinventionist and anti-American. The College Board has said it stands behind the Jefferson County student protesters. It's also warned that course can no longer officially bear the AP designation if a school or district censors essential concepts from an AP course. Also speaking on MSNBC last week, the president of the Jefferson County PTA, Michelle Patterson, voiced her concerns about academic censorship.
This is not just about AP history. This committee would have the ability to look at all curriculum at any grade level and present to the board anything that they find objectionable. And then the board would have the chance to look at their objections and take potential action. So it really opens the door wide to censorship.
That was PTA President Michelle Patterson on MSNBC. Last week on Fox News, host Gretchen Carlson criticized students and teachers in Colorado protesting proposed changes to their history curriculum.
And what does it say about our young people in this country and the teachers joining the protest that promoting patriotism is now a negative? Ironically, the new curriculum being proposed is all about promoting individual rights, like protesting. The new curriculum would also teach a free market system, like the one we already have. It would also encourage that there be no disregard for the law. Isn't that why we have laws on the books?
That's Fox News host Gretchen Carlson. Ashlyn Marr, you're a high school senior. Can you respond?
Well, I saw this interview, and further in the interview, she calls all of us little punks. And personally, I do not agree with what she's saying. I am saying that we are standing up for our individual rights, and we want to make sure that we learn the facts, patriotic or not. Everyone's made mistakes, and we learn history, and we learn those mistakes as to not make them again in the future. You know, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. So that is what we are saying.
And John Ford, your reaction as a longtime teacher to the continuing efforts of some forces in this country to sort of try to determine what you as a teacher and what educators can teach their students?
Yeah, I think the frustrating part of this is we have professionals in classrooms who dedicate their entire lives to teaching kids, and those professionals know better. And I want to make this point because I had a conversation with a math teacher a couple of months ago, and she was distraught. And I asked her, you know, what's going on? And she said, well, this board majority is using my passion against me. And I wake up every day with that ringing in my ears.
The New York Times writes, the board has drawn praise from Americans for Prosperity Colorado, a conservative group affiliated with the Koch family foundations. In April, Dustin Zvonek, the group's director, wrote an op-ed that the board's election was an exciting and hopeful moment for the county and the school district. Are the Koch brothers involved with this school board?
I don't know. But what I do know is Jefferson County has a long tradition of being a collaborative education institution for the entire community. And one thing that I'd like to point out, I was born and raised there, and my kids go to these schools. And Jefferson County is a community, and that community really means something. And I'm sure if you talk to these students, that's why they're reacting the way they are. If there's outside forces trying to push an agenda in our school district, that'd be really concerning. And you know what? We'll find out.
Well, but if there was this extreme group that got control of the school board, that obviously means that there was not a high level of participation in the school board elections. Could you talk about that and the dangers when communities do not get involved in their school board elections?
Yeah, about 33% of the voting population that could vote voted. Elections matter, and especially school board elections. Lots of times we put focus on the national level and maybe our state level elections, but our school board elections are going to be unbelievably critical in the next couple of election cycles.
Ashlyn, you're a high school senior. Will you be voting in the next elections?
I sure hope so, because this issue does not stop affecting me when I graduate. I have a little brother and a little sister that will grow up in the Jeffco community, and I want them to have the best education possible. And I really want them to be presented with the facts, just like I was. I really don't think that they should be taught somebody else's opinion.
Well, Ashlyn Marr, I want to thank you for being with us. Ashlyn Marr, Chatfield High School senior, one of the students who is leading the protests over the proposed curriculum changes, and John Ford, president of the Jefferson County Education Association, a social studies teacher at Moore Middle School. When we come back from break, an astonishing story about a 16-year-old high school sophomore who was accused of stealing a backpack. He wound up on Rikers Island in jail for close to 3 years, 2 of those years in solitary confinement. You'll find out his story. Stay with us.
What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that Washington never told a lie. I learned that soldiers seldom die. I learned that everybody's free. That's what the teacher said to me, and that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that policemen are my friends. I learned that justice never ends. I learned that murderers die for the crimes, even if we make a mistake sometime. And that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned our government must be strong. It's always right and never wrong. Our leaders are the finest men, and we elect them again and again. And that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that war is not so bad. I learned about the great ones we have had. We fought in Germany and in France, and someday I might get my chance. And that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school.
The legendary Pete Seeger performing Tom Paxton's What Did You Learn in School Today? This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, last week, the New York City Department of Corrections announced it will stop using solitary confinement to punish adolescents held in its troubled Rikers Island jail complex, the second largest jail system in the country. But a federal prosecutor said the city's reforms were moving too slowly to address a, quote, culture of violence, and warned he may file a civil lawsuit over conditions for teenagers held in Rikers. New York is one of only 2 states nationwide that automatically charge 16 and 17-year-olds as adults.
Well, today we look at the incredible story of a 16-year-old high school sophomore who was jailed at Rikers Island for nearly 3 years after he refused to plead guilty to a crime he said he did not commit. It was May 15, 2010, when Khalif Browder was walking home from a party with his friends in the Bronx and was stopped by police based on a tip that he'd robbed someone weeks earlier. He told HuffPost Live what happened next.
They had searched me, and the guy actually said, at first he said I robbed him, and I didn't have anything on me. And that's
you
when...
say nothing, you mean no weapon and none of his property?
No weapon, no money, anything he said that I allegedly robbed him for. So the guy actually changed up his story and said that I actually tried to rob him, but then another police officer came and they said that I robbed him 2 weeks prior, and then they said, we're going to take you to the precinct, and most likely we're going to let you go home, and then I never went home.
Kalief Browder did not go home for 33 months, even though he was never convicted. For nearly 800 days of that time, he was held in solitary confinement. He maintained his innocence and requested a trial, but was only offered plea deals while the trial was repeatedly delayed. Near the end of his time in jail, the judge offered to sentence him to time served if he entered a guilty plea and told him he could face 15 years in prison if he was convicted. He refused to accept the deal and was only released when the case was dismissed.
Well, for more, we're joined by Jennifer Gonnerman, reporter, author, contributing editor at New York Magazine. She recounts Kalief Browder's story in the current issue of The New Yorker. In a piece headlined, "Before the Law, a boy was accused of taking a backpack. The courts took the next 3 years of his life." Jennifer Gonnerman has long chronicled problems with the criminal justice system. Her book, Life on the Outside, The Prison Odyssey of Elaine Bartlett, tells the story of a woman who spent 16 years in prison for a first-time offense under New York's Rockefeller drug laws. And we're joined by Kalief Browder's current attorney, Paul Prestia, who has filed a lawsuit against the city, the NYPD, the New York Police Department, the Bronx District Attorney, and the Department of Corrections on Browder's behalf. Prestia is also a former assistant prosecutor in Brooklyn. Jennifer Gonnerman, Paul Prestia, welcome to Democracy Now! Jennifer, tell us Kalief's story.
Well, you did a pretty good job of setting it up, and it was terrific that we got to hear Kalief's voice describing what happened. But just to recap a bit, May 2010, he's coming home from a party late one night in the Bronx, walking with his friend down the street, and a police car pulls up. There's somebody in the back seat who points him out, saying, accusing him of a robbery that had happened 1 or 2 weeks earlier. He says, "I didn't do it."
First he actually says, "I didn't steal anything tonight. Right. Look at my pockets." Right. And then they went back and checked with the guy, and they said, oh, this happened a couple weeks ago.
Right. So from the beginning, it sounded like, at least in the way Kalief tells it, some confusion about the dates, which is significant. And he goes into the precinct thinking, and he's in the holding cell, thinking, I'm just going to be here for a couple hours. We'll clear up this misunderstanding. And as you said, he ended up doing almost 3 years on Rikers Island for many reasons. But the system sort of completely failed him in every possible way. There was no speedy trial, and during that time, he was locked up in the adolescent jail on Rikers Island.
Explain Rikers.
Sure. When we talk about Rikers Island, it's a jail complex. There's 10 different jails there, and I think a lot of people get confused between prison and jail. A prison is where you go after you've been convicted and sentenced. A jail is where you go while you're waiting for your case to go through the court. On Rikers Island, 85% of the people locked up there are legally innocent. They have not been convicted of a crime yet. And they may never be convicted of a crime. They're there waiting to find out whether they're guilty or innocent and what their fate is going to be. And so Kalief was one of those people. So despite the fact that he was not convicted of a crime, he endured the punishment anyway.
But he ended up basically in Rikers because he couldn't make bail, right? Because it was a relatively minor charge. The judge ended up giving him bail time, but releasing his co-defendant as well. Could you explain why that happened?
Sure. So from the beginning of the case, there were 2 co-defendants, and Kalief's co-defendant, the other friend, was released from day one, and so he got to wait at home while the case went through the system. And Kalief's bail was set at $3,000 because he was already on probation in a prior case. So he had a mark against him, and that mark sort of chased him for the next 3 years. Ultimately, they filed a violation of probation against him, which meant that he was remanded. So even though the bail was $3,000, it was out of the reach of his family. Even if they had spent time fundraising from everybody they knew, ultimately it didn't matter because he was remanded. There was no bail set for 3 years. So he was held without bail while this case sort of crawled through the court system.
Well, and just to clarify, on that prior conviction, that was a youthful offender adjudication. So that theoretically was sealed from his record. So while he was convicted, he was 16 at the time, and that conviction was sealed from his record. Not something that should have been used against him, but perhaps an anomaly because he was on probation at the same time. In any event, as Jen pointed out, I would have titled her piece, and it was an excellent piece. Obviously, I spoke with her in depth while she was writing the article. I would have titled it "The Criminal Justice System Deconstructed." And I can go through all of those aspects with you, but I know that...
I wanted to ask you particularly about this whole issue of
people being held in jail, in essence, to pressure them to plead out. Because we often see the criminal justice system on television as these trials, these dramatic trials. But I've always felt that the essence of the criminal justice system in America, 95% of the cases, are the plea bargains. People being pressured not to go to trial, but to plead guilty. And if you could talk about how that's used time in and over and over again to get defendants to plead out.
Well, I don't know if it's a tactic per se. I don't know if it's something intentional per se that the district attorney's office, a technique that the district attorney's office uses to...
And you were a prosecutor, so you probably did it all the time.
I'm familiar with all of these things, Amy. I know how it goes, for sure. But I think it's understood that if someone's... It's just common sense. If someone's in jail and they're desperate to get out, they're more inclined to take a plea. It's just human nature to do anything, to find any way to get out of that jail, especially if you've spent some time in solitary.
That's what is so amazing about Khalif. When the Bronx judge is replaced by a Brooklyn judge, and she begins to see what he's been through and says, you will be out today after 2.5 years, just plead. You face 15 years in jail if you go to trial. And he said no. I mean, all the other prisoners said, are you crazy to him? This is a kid. He said, I'm innocent. I'm not going to say I was guilty.
I mean, it's incredible. Obviously, the longer you're incarcerated in jail, the greater the pressure to plead, right? And for somebody like Khalif, who was in one of the worst jails, he was in the adolescent jail in Rikers Island, which the U.S. Attorney's Office recently put out a blistering report about the horrific conditions there. On top of that, he spent most of his time in solitary confinement. So it just ratchets up the pressure more and more and more. You know, he could not have been under greater pressure to plead, and yet, despite all that, he just said to that day to the judge, you know, made that offer, and he said, I'm all right. I didn't do it. I'm all right. And the judge says, you're all right? I mean, clearly he was not all right, but he said, I'm all right. Like, I got this. I could do it. And she said, you're all right? And he said, I want to go to trial. The same thing he had been saying for 3 years. But trials rarely happen in the Bronx. And that's sort of one of the sort of dirty secrets of the whole system.
To me, one of the most stunning parts of your article is when you list from the court files all the continuances that occurred in this trial. While he's waiting, demanding to go to trial, you have from the court file, June 23rd, 2011, people not ready, request 1 week. But that 1 week turns into, looks like 3 months, August 24th, 2011. People not ready, request 1 day. Then November 4th, 2011, people not ready, prosecutor on trial, request 2 weeks. Then December 2nd, 2011, prosecutor on trial, request January 3rd. So each time it was the prosecutors who were delaying the start of a trial.
That's true. And then it would, once they asked for a week or 2 weeks, it would turn into a matter of scheduling. And everybody looks at their calendars, and maybe the prosecutor can't do it, or maybe the judge can't do it, or maybe the defense attorney can't. And it became a sort of logistics game at every court date. But, you know, 1 or 2 weeks turning into 6 weeks, you know, for somebody like Khalif, that's 6 more weeks that he's got to wait.
And what about the role of the prior attorney? Because you weren't there from the beginning, Paul Presto.
No, I wasn't.
His initial,
I'll make that clear.
Right, his initial attorney, and you also tried to find out what that initial attorney, who was appointed by the court, did or did not do.
Right. He was a court-appointed lawyer. It's called 18B lawyer in New York City, but a court-appointed lawyer paid $75 an hour to represent Khalif. And you know, it's a system that has been criticized over the years because in order to make a living, you got to have a lot of cases, and those lawyers are sort of running around the city all the time. And you know, so he never visited his client on Rikers Island.
That means he never visited his client because he was on Rikers Island the whole time.
That's correct. And, you know, as sad as it is, it's not that uncommon for 18B lawyers never to make the trip to Rikers Island because it's like a half-a-day, you know, nightmare. You know, they have video conferences in the Bronx where you can talk to your client, you know, face to face. And, you know, I asked him, had he ever done that? He said, I'm pretty sure I did. And then I asked Khalif, did he remember having a video conference with his lawyer? And he said no. So, you know, I don't know. Paul could probably speak better to this.
What about a speedy trial? I mean, there might be a lot of people watching this around the country and around the world now saying, wasn't a law broken here that this kid, from when he was 16 years old, was in prison, 2 of those years in solitary?
I know, you can't even wrap your brain around it. It's so crazy, the whole story. So in New York, you know, so the 6th Amendment, you know, guarantees the right, you know, to a speedy trial. And in New York, we have something called the ready rule. So when these prosecutors, as Juan was reading off the lists, say, you know, we're not ready, but we can be ready in a week. So that's 1 week charged against them. Yet the next court date is set 1 month, 2 months, 3 months away. So that only counts as 1 week against the 6-month deadline that we have in New York. So even though he was held for 3 years, it's not like there's the 3 years count against him. It's every week or 2 weeks or 1 day that the prosecutors ask for. So time is moving in 2 separate ways. There's the sort of the world of the courthouse where time is moving at a glacial pace, and then there's Khalif's life where every day feels like 10 because he's trapped in a box in Rikers Island.
It's a figurative clock that stops and starts throughout the case. But agreed with Jennifer's legal analysis, the adjournments were appalling and should have been challenged at some point, in my opinion, by the attorney, and should not have been allowed to persist by the judges who oversaw the case.
Let's bring Khalif's voice back into this conversation. Khalif Browder told HuffPost Live's Mark Lamont Hill that while he was in solitary confinement at Rikers, the guards often refused to give him his meals.
If you say anything that could tick them off in any type of way, some of them, which is a lot of them, what they do is they starve you, they won't feed you, and it's already hard in there because if you get the 3 trays that you get every day, you're still hungry because I guess that's part of the punishment. So if they starve you 1 tray, that could really make an impact on you. And
how much were you starved?
I was starved a lot. I can't even count.
Khalif Browder went on to say he was once starved 4 times in a row, no breakfast, lunch, dinner, or breakfast again. Talk about the conditions of solitary confinement and how a kid, a teenager, would end up in solitary confinement for 2 years.
Sure. I mean, what Khalif's talking about being hungry in jail, and even though he's talking about one instance, in fact, it was a much sort of broader problem. So when you're in solitary confinement, you get 3 meals a day coming through a slot in the door because you're not leaving your cell. And for teenagers locked in solitary, and this is not just Khalif, this is other teenagers have talked about this, there's not enough food. And once you're in solitary, you know, when you're in general population, the regular jail, if you're not getting enough food, you can maybe get some money in your commissary account and get some snacks and fill up your stomach.
And his mom did put money in commissary.
His mother did look out for him and visited him every week. So here he is stuck in solitary. He can't supplement his meal. He's reduced to begging officers through the cell door, can I get an extra piece of bread? Sometimes they give it, sometimes they laugh at him. And, you know, you basically, there's 12-hour stretch from dinner to breakfast where all these teenagers are drinking water out of the sink to fill their stomachs. And, you know, when he told me this at first, I thought, well, maybe it's just him, or maybe it's a one-off thing, or, you know, he was talking about meals being skipped, but I'm saying it's a broader sort of problem. But there was a recent report that came out from Bronx Defenders Organization where they talked about many of their clients with similar complaints. And, you know, for a moment I thought, did we just, you know, just pick up this kid off the street in the Bronx and drop him in Guantanamo? I mean, this is the kind of thing that, you know, that you guys cover all the time. It seemed, frankly, almost unbelievable.
What about the whole issue of his education? I mean, he was a 16-year-old sophomore. What kind of educational support does Rikers give the 16 and 17-year-olds that it jails?
You know, the adolescents in the regular jail were supposed to be taken every day to class, to a school that they have there, and they're taught by Department of Education. You know, Department of Education runs school. But once a kid was put into solitary, they weren't being taken out for school anymore. And what they would do is slip a worksheet under the door in the morning, an officer would, or a few, and you're finish this by Wednesday, finish this by Thursday. So Khalif's sitting there, he's got nothing to do. He thinks, well, I might as well do something. I might as well try to do this, you know. So he's kind of trying to teaching himself how to be a better writer, math, et cetera. And then Thursday comes, you know, time moving at this incredibly slow pace, and nobody comes to pick up the work. I mean, that didn't always happen, but it happened often enough. And I mean, it's just, you know, it's a small detail, but it just shows the utter apathy, you know, and lack of concern for everybody in there. So he's banging on the door. Where's the correction officer to pick up the work? You know, he's trying to, you know, improve himself in this, you know, absolutely nightmare of a place.
I don't even think apathy is the word. It's just a reckless disregard for any of those kids who sat in solitary. It's sad, really.
And Paul Presti, the reaction of the prosecutors in the case, and especially when you got involved, didn't anybody say, hey, this is a kid who's been in jail for close to 3 years and still has not been brought to trial?
I'm sorry about that. I missed your question.
The reaction of the prosecutors that you were dealing with.
Well, I didn't actually deal with the prosecutors because I took over the case after it got dismissed.
After it got dismissed.
So after it got dismissed, Khalif came to see me, and he retained me to represent him in the civil case against the state of New York, against the city of New York. I'm sorry.
In August, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York issued a report that sharply criticized Rikers jail officials for routinely using extreme violence against adolescent prisoners, often in areas without video surveillance cameras. It also condemned the excessive use of solitary confinement for teenagers held there. This is the U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara.
Rikers Island is a broken institution for adolescents. And a broken institution will produce broken people, especially when they are young and fragile with mental illness, as so many of them are. The adolescents in Rikers are walled off from the public, but they are not walled off from the Constitution. Indeed, most of these young men are pretrial detainees, presumed innocent until proven guilty. But whether they are pretrial or convicted, they are entitled to be detained safely and in accordance with their constitutional rights, not consigned to a corrections crucible that seems more inspired by Lord of the Flies than any legitimate philosophy of humane detention.
U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara speaking in August. Last week, he said New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio had failed to move quickly on reforms called for in the report and warned his office was ready to file a civil rights lawsuit against the city to force changes. Preet Bharara could conceivably be a possibility for Attorney General Jen Gonnerman.
You know, this report came out in the course of me reporting this story, came out in August. And back in April, when I was first interviewing Khalif, I think maybe the very first time I met him, he told me this incredible story that had happened early in his time at Rikers, a few days in, of late at night, there had been some sort of fight in the dorm. The officers weren't sure who was...
50 kids in the dorm.
Right, 50 kids in the dorm.
Room.
Officers weren't sure who was responsible, so they grabbed whoever they could find, threw them in the hall, and you know, their faces to the wall, and just, you know, started, you know, kind of trying to figure out who did it, and yelling at them and smacking them in the face each time, and really beating some of the kids up. And so Khalif tells me this incredible story of, you know, leaky noses and sort of swollen eyes, and at the end, the officers say, okay, you know, we can either take you to the clinic, which means, and if you tell the folks who work at the clinic, the civilian medical staff, what happened, you're going to end up in solitary. Or you can just go back to bed and pretend nothing happened. So Khalif and the other guys say, okay, we'll go back to bed. He tells me this incredible story in April. I think that is, I didn't doubt him, but I just thought, is that like a one-time thing? What is going on Rikers Island? I mean, I knew the conditions were very bad in the adolescent jail, but that was a level of brutality that was pretty, you know, hard to wrap your mind around. Then come August, this report comes out, and I would encourage anybody who's interested to read this report, because even though government reports are sometimes a little dry, this one is incredible in the level of graphic detail and the way it's written. It just...
And it's specific to the years 2011 and 2013, coincidentally when Khalif was incarcerated and was in solitary confinement.
And this story I just described is, you know, it's told again and again in this report. It certainly wasn't a one-time occurrence.
And it's clear that, listen, I know that the corrections officers, their jobs can be difficult. That goes without saying. But to create your own code of justice, which is what happens in these jails, and to just mete out punishments to these kids, these young men who are, as Jennifer pointed out, they're innocent. They're awaiting a trial. They're waiting for their case to be heard. But yet, in those jails, and I would argue, in my opinion, in those prosecutors' minds, presumed guilty.
Khalif, attempted suicide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that happened several times in Rikers Island, and, you know, it's totally understandable, considering considering the conditions. And, you know, and Rikers had, this is hopefully going to change, but there was a lot of teenagers put into solitary as sort of the ultimate management tool, the way they were dealing with unruly population. There was like almost an addiction to solitary confinement. And once in solitary, you know, as study after study shows, the incredible impact on one's mental health. So you can have inmates going in who didn't have any mental health problems coming out a broken person. You know, the paranoia, the lack of trust, the sort of, you know, being overwhelmed by stimulation. I mean, Khalif, since he's been out, you can still see the impact of solitary, even though he's been home for 16 months. I mean, he, you know, at times, you know, like his brother was telling me, you know, I'll invite Khalif to the movies. Do you want to go out, do something fun? And Khalif says, no, I don't want to do that. And he'd rather sort of retreat and be in his room at home, door closed, almost recreating the conditions of solitary, and feels more comfortable like that sometimes than out in the world.
I've spent a lot of time with Khalif, and quite honestly, I don't see how he could ever be the same after that experience. And
what are you hoping with the lawsuit to be able to accomplish in terms of the responsibility for what happened?
Well, obviously, we're asking this. We need the city to be accountable, to take accountability, to admit that what happened here was unjust, it was unlawful, it was unconstitutional, and it was wrong, and it was. Nothing they can say can justify Khalif Browder's ordeal. The police can't justify it, corrections can't justify it, the district attorney's office can't justify it, in my opinion. There's no way. I've gone through everything in this case, from the arrest where you have a victim whose credibility is highly at issue.
Well, he had gone back to Mexico, you learned, at the very end.
And ultimately, that's
No, it wasn't at the very end. I don't believe it was at the very end.
Do you believe he disappeared at the beginning?
I suspect it was long before the date of the dismissal. And
that's why they kept asking for delays.
Right, of course. Of course. Because if he was available, Amy, he could have been brought in. Well, let's see. The case was first on for trial in a trial posture in December of 2010. Giving them the benefit of the doubt, he could have been brought in much soon, it's sometime in 2011 at the very least. All they had to do in this trial was bring this victim in and testify as to what happened. And the problem here is Khalif was innocent. He was always innocent. And they arrest him based on this, a victim whose credibility was clearly at issue, without any other evidence to go forward on this case, a case that should have never been prosecuted. And then, to add insult to injury, he has to spend those 3 years in Rikers. And the ironic thing, Amy, and I know you have to continue, is that they accused him of stealing a backpack, right? As you said in your opening. Yet, at the end of the day, they stole Khalif Browder's innocence.
We're going to leave it there, and I thank you so much for being with us. Paul Presti, attorney for Khalif Browder, Jennifer Gonnerman, reporter, author. Her latest story is in The New Yorker. You've got to read it. It's headlined, Before the Law. A boy was accused of taking a backpack. The courts took the next 3 years of his life. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. We'll be back in a minute. Mélange Paddington Bear. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We end today's show with a look at another case of prisoners held in jail indefinitely, this time in Mississippi. The American Civil Liberties Union has filed a federal lawsuit against Scott County, which is about 25 miles from the capital of Jackson, over allegations that it has held prisoners for nearly a year without formal charge or access to an attorney. The two plaintiffs named in the case are Octavius Burks, held for more than 10 months without formal charge, and Joshua Bassett, held for 8 months. Burks was arrested for armed robbery and Bassett for grand larceny and possession of methamphetamine. Overall, the ACLU estimates at least 50 people are being held in the Scott County Jail in a similar situation, no indictment and no access to a lawyer.
For more, we're joined by Brandon Buskey, staff attorney with the Criminal Law Reform Project at the ACLU, lead attorney in the case in Scott County, Mississippi. Welcome to Democracy Now! How did you find this case? Lay out what you found there.
Well, we have been investigating the situation in Mississippi throughout the state for roughly a year and a half. We knew coming in that there was a serious problem with the right to counsel throughout the state, and also that individuals, even before they are formally charged with the crime, faced an indefinite amount of time in jail because the state places no limit on the amount of time that an individual may be in jail before the prosecutor has to bring a formal indictment. So in making contacts throughout the state and talking to public defenders, talking to judges, talking to civil rights lawyers, we were able to establish a fairly decent network. And it so happened that about 2 months ago, we received a call concerning Octavius Burks, the individual that you showed on the screen just there. It was from his family. They were completely desperate and seeking help, trying to understand what was happening with their son. He had been in jail since November of last year on an attempted armed robbery charge. It's a very serious charge. However, he wanted his day in court, and he wanted a lawyer. But in Scott County, he was not being provided with either of those. And so when they reached out to us, they wanted to know why he had not been assigned an attorney and why it had taken so long even to bring a formal charge, and if he was going to be charged at all in the case. So we began looking into it, making visits, seeking documents, and we found out that basically the standing policy in Scott County, like in so many other places throughout Mississippi, is not to assign an individual an attorney until they've been indicted. Now, if you're in New York City, for example, that may not be a big deal because the prosecutor has only 6 days from the time of arrest to bring an indictment. However, in Scott County, what we learned, the grand jury only issues indictments about 3 times per year. So if you're simply arrested during the wrong period of the year, you're automatically waiting 3 and perhaps 5 months to even find out if the state intends to proceed against you. In Octavius's case, the state had missed several indictment dates in his case, and that is why he had been languishing in jail since November. And so once we found that out about his case, once we looked further into the situation in the Scott County Jail and found that there were dozens of other people who were facing a very similar situation, we decided that we had to take action.
And all these years, there's never been a challenge in the federal courts about the due process situations here?
No, there had not. And you know, this is one of the things that we're really seeking to establish here is some basic fundamental rights that have not been pressed through the courts and answered by the Supreme Court.
And how typical is Scott County?
Throughout Mississippi, Scott County, I fear, is fairly typical. You know, I've talked with public defenders and others throughout the state, and the story is very consistent. I've had public defenders tell me that until you're indicted on a case, I don't know you exist. In the New York Times did a wonderful piece about this situation. The senior circuit judge who is named in this lawsuit said, well, I had never heard of these cases. I can't do anything about this case until it gets into my court. And this is a judge who oversees the entire court system. And I think that attitude pervades the entire state. However, I do want to point out that this is not simply a problem for Mississippi. It's a problem nationwide, and the ACLU has been looking at these cases throughout the country in states like New York, Utah, Pennsylvania. The problem is pervasive.
Well, I want to thank you, and we will certainly continue to follow this. Brandon Buskey, staff attorney with the Criminal Law Reform Project of the ACLU, lead attorney in the Scott County, Mississippi case. That does it for the show. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berker, Nefel Sarmate, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcoff, Hani Masood, Ravi Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield. Special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.